Hello, my name is David LeMay, and I want to welcome you to this first video in a series of videos on Java programming for FIRST Robotics. I've been a mentor for FIRST Robotics for the last 7 years and a software developer for over 30 years. I work with Team 247 from Berkeley High School in Berkeley, Michigan. The team name is Da Bears. So I'd like to begin this by explaining a little bit about what we're planning on doing here. This series of videos is meant to help students understand Java programming and some of the common problems that come up when trying to program for FIRST Robotics. It's not exclusive to FIRST Robotics. Any student can get some information about it, but it's also not intended to be a FIRST programming class. It's not a substitute for what you might take in a high school programming class or what you might learn from a book on Teach Yourself Java programming or something like that. It's assumed that you probably have at least a little bit of programming experience. You know a little bit about making a program. You know a little bit about variables and functions and the core of programming. It's kind of a supplement then to a traditional programming class. Some of it will be very specific to FIRST Robotics, but those are the later videos. We're going to begin by just talking about how to program in Java, and by going a little bit more in depth than you probably did in your high school class. This will become apparent why when we go to the first specific portions of the course, of the series of videos, I should say. The topics, sorry for constantly looking over at my notes. This isn't a professional video, I'm a volunteer. But anyway, the topics that I'm going to cover are things that I have experience in dealing with high school students in the FIRST Robotics program. I find that the courses that they typically take in high school or the books that they've used to teach themselves how to program have left them with some gaps and some misunderstandings or incomplete understandings. And I've just seen enough to see frequent errors that I think can be solved by a little bit more understanding of the key principles involved. So we're not going to do a whole lot of writing of programs in this video series. The good news means that means no homework. But I'm going to illustrate, using programs that I've written, some common errors, misunderstandings, and pitfalls, and some common areas where a little bit of core depth understanding of the principles might save you some trouble. So, without further ado, in this first video, all we're going to do is set up the programming environment. If you've done any programming, you know that in addition to the programs that you write, you have to set up something like maybe a text editor or a compiler or some sort of tools that help you write programs and write better programs. So that's what we're going to cover in video number 1. We are going to use Visual Studio Code as our development environment. Visual Studio Code, which is not the same thing as Visual Studio. They're both Microsoft products, but they are not the same product. So make sure we're dealing with Visual Studio Code. Visual Studio Code is an environment where you can program in several programming languages, but we're only going to be dealing with Java in this class. It is free. That's one of the main reasons we use it. And the other main reason is it is what is used primarily for Java programs in FIRST Robotics. The version of Visual Studio Code that we're going to use is the generic downloadable version. This is not exactly the same as you veterans might have seen before in FIRST Robotics. You've probably seen something that includes what we call the WPI libraries. These are things that are very specific to FIRST Robotics and to programming on the RoboRio that is used to run our robots. We're going to be writing Windows programs here, although I think most of them would also work on Linux. I just haven't tested them on Linux. So we're going to be sticking with Windows programs because that's what most people are most familiar with. We're going to use the basic version of Visual Studio Code, and that should suffice for the first several videos in this class. At some point we will actually program on the RoboRio, and that will be very specific to FIRST Robotics. But for all students right now, these should be applicable, and we should program on Windows. So let's get started with programming. We're going to first show you how to download Visual Studio Code and how to install what is called a Java JDK. So let's begin. So now we're going to install the Java JDK. You may wonder what a JDK is. It's something that allows you to run Java on your computer, basically. So we're going to go to download, and JDK download is what you want. All right. You want to make sure that one of the options is at oracle.com. Anything else might lead you to the wrong place. So it should be the first one in your list, but if it isn't, look for it and make sure you're only downloading it from oracle.com. So go to download, and eventually you should get to this place right here, Java SE downloads. You want the JDK download. It'll tell you some very important things. What you want is the 64-bit Windows version, so find that in the list. Tell them that you reviewed the license agreement. Of course you didn't, but tell them that anyway, and then download it. It doesn't take very long. You can see the progress bar running, and it will take a minute or so, but it's very quickly. A little music while you wait. Do, 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 do. It's kind of like in the alliance selections, you know, it's very impatient for the people who aren't making those alliance picks. Okay. There, it's all done. Now we're going to open it. And that just opens the installer. So you're going to get an installer pop up eventually. Okay. There we go. And yep, do you really want to do that? Yeah, you do. Accept the default location. You don't have to, but it'll just cause grief if you don't. So you're better off, unless you really know what you're doing, accepting the default location. This goes on a bit long, so I'm going to edit portions of this out. And when we're done, we hit next. And that install is pretty quick. Takes some time to copy the files, not much. There we go. All right, skip the next steps. You can click on them if you want. It'll tell you some stuff. You probably won't understand it. We'll go on for now. Hit close. And we want to verify that we were actually done here. And I want to show you where it ended up. So it ended up in your program files document, program files folder. You've got two program files folders. One's program files, one is program files x86. You're looking for the program files. That's where 64-bit programs end up. If you had a 32-bit JDK, it would end up in program files x86. So hopefully you've got a 64-bit. So click on that there, and you'll see a folder called Java. There it is. And in it, we'll have your JDKs. You notice I've installed 2 of them. This is the second one. You'll probably only have 1, but you can install multiples at the same time. You really only need the latest version, and that's it. So after we have that, we're now ready to install VS Code. So let's go over and work on that. So now that we've installed a JDK, we're going to go ahead and install Visual Studio Code. And once again, we're going to go to Google, and we're going to type in download VS Code. You can see I've already done it, so I just select it, just type it in. You'll see that you go to code.visualstudio.com. Make sure you're going to that site. If you go to a site other than that, you might be getting a third-party thing, or worse, the worst possible thing is a virus. We're going to download for Windows, and this will just give us the default most recent version. No reason not to use the most recent version. We're not trying to be compatible with anybody in particular. It's going to assume that it's a 64-bit Windows machine. Almost all current machines are that way, so probably whatever laptop you're using or desktop will be 64-bit. If not, most of these steps should work pretty close to identically, but hopefully you'll have a 64-bit. So we hit execute. We want to open the file. Of course, we accept the agreement, even though we haven't read it. Let's hope that works. We accept the default location for download, because it'll just cause trouble if you don't. All right, so now we're ready to do the actual installation. So we select Next there. It'll just tell you what you'd like to call it, and of course you want to call it Visual Studio Code. I do think you'll be better off if you create a desktop icon, because you don't have to find it all the time. This will put it on your desktop. It's optional. These other ones, they could be useful, but let's skip them for now unless you are sure you know what you're doing with them. You may find that that's useful later, and we can come back to that. So now you're ready to install, and you see it also goes pretty quickly. There's not a whole lot of time required to make this happen. So as it copies files and files and files, here we go. All right, that's it. And let's just launch it right away. If not, we could go to your desktop icon that you installed and launch it from there, or search for it, Visual Studio Code. If you happen to have Visual Studio installed, make sure that you know it's a different thing. Visual Studio Code is not Visual Studio. All right. So we should be ready at this point. So we hit Finish, and up pops Visual Studio Code. Here's the main window. Okay. We're ready to start programming. And to do that, we're going to open a new folder. There's a few different ways you can start. I'm going to start by opening a new folder. And I've already created a folder called Java Samples under my Documents folder. You can put it wherever you want. This is just something that I've done. If you want to make sure you're compatible with what I'm doing, then create something, a program called, a folder called Java Samples, and that'll be great. But you don't really need to. We are going to create a new folder under that. Make a new folder every time you do a new program. That's what the compiler is going to be looking for. So we're going to get a new folder, and following the tradition of programming, we're going to call our first program Hello World. You've probably already created a Hello World project because everybody uses it. Because what it does is just verify that you can actually create a program and call it and have it print out Hello World. So there it is. There's a place for it anyway. Want to select it and then create a new file. All right. And the first thing we're going to do before we even start typing is change the name of the file. Why are we going to do that? Well, because then we're going to change it to something that ends in Java, so our program is going to know that it's a Java program. So instead of untitled1, we're going to call it helloworld.java. All right. The .java is what's really important. Now, something important just happened. Notice that little box down there. The Java extension package is recommended for this file type. Well, it certainly is, and that's going to pop up assuming you haven't installed it already. So we're going to want to install that before we go any further. So click Install. If for some reason you skip this step, it can be installed later. It just requires you to go off to Google, find it, and install it. And that could be error prone, so hopefully you got it here. But if not, go ahead and try and find it on Google, this Java extension pack for VS Code. If you're on Team 247, you can ask me. All right. It's going to show you like what's available in this. There's a whole lot of information on what new stuff is there and how it works for you. Go ahead and select this exclude in workspace there. I'll explain a little bit about that later. It's not critical. We can keep going. And here I'm just showing, I'm just illustrating that there's a lot of information here. You can look through it at your leisure. It'll talk about some of the capabilities and different ways of, I'm going to do one thing in a certain way. You can do it in a different ways. So we're going to be able to see exactly what you can do in all of these things. So let's move on. Sorry, just clicking around a few things. Now we're going to go back to programming. Oh, I guess I don't need the whole point of that exercise with it. I don't need a new program. I just renamed helloworld.java. Okay, so we're going to start by writing a Hello World class. Java is a object-oriented programming language, and so everything has to be in a class. We'll explain a little bit about what that means and what a class is in later videos. If you've done Java, you know about it, but for those of you who are coming from Python, you might not quite see what it is, or some other programming language. They have to match the names, though. A class called Hello World has to be in a file called helloworld.java. That's not true in C#, but it's true in some other, in Java. All right. Every Java program starts with a main function, and it has to look exactly like this. Public static void main. It has an argument which is a string array called args. We'll explain what all those things mean later, but what you need to know right away is that it has to be exactly like that every single time. All right, and for this one, though, the contents are just going to be a command to print hello world. And to do that, we have system.out.println. Notice that if you've installed the Java extensions, you'll see all these suggestions of what you might mean. So that'll help you fill in without typing as much. We're just going to do system.out.println. That basically means print to the screen or to wherever. On a RoboRio, it means to print to the driver station. For now, though, we're printing to our Windows screen, just at the command prompt or the text line in the terminal window. Got to end with a semicolon there. Okay. Got it. Now we're ready. We go to run, and we're going to run without debugging. We're just going to run it straight through, and you'll see a terminal window open up, and look in there, there's the line Hello World. That's what your program printed out. That's it. You've written your first Java program using Visual Studio Code. This proves that Visual Studio Code is up and running and that the Java extensions are correctly installed, and you're ready to get down to some real work in the next video. Okay, that's it for this video. We'll be seeing you next time, where we'll talk about all sorts of things related to variables. We'll cover how to make them, how to use them. See you next time.